All right, welcome back out to A Case for America. This is Austin Hepworth here with Michael Hepworth, and we are today talking about the Second Amendment. And we, in A Case for America, love to go through and discuss principles that we feel have helped make America what it is. And we certainly want to look at the downside to certain things. And so today in the Second Amendment discussion, we will try and be pretty frank about guns and ownership of guns, the Second Amendment, what it talks about, as well as the harm that guns or people with guns, you could say, have caused or allegedly caused. And we want to go through and have a pretty open discussion about this. But to remind you, we do have a couple things that about how we approach, sorry, a couple things about how we approach what we are looking at. First, to bring this up again, haven't brought this up for a little bit. If you're just listening, you won't see this, but this highlights something that we believe about liberty. Almost anytime I hear liberty or freedom discussed today, I feel most people view it as a state of anarchy. There's a significant number of people that talk about this, or online commentators. Maybe they're intentionally doing it to make light of it. I don't know, but liberty is not a state of no law. Laws are necessary for liberty to exist. We feel that anarchy on one side with no law, and if you have tyranny on the other side where there's law saying everything, liberty is the balance in the middle. Law is necessary to pull society out of a state of anarchy, but it's also necessary to have a place of no law where you need private solutions instead. And we feel that the text of the song America the Beautiful talks about this, where it talks about America confirming thy soul in self-control, thy liberty and law, to say it takes law to make liberty, but it takes self-control to keep everything in balance. And so those are the principles that we look at as we go through this. So today, starting off, we wanted to mention the text of the Second Amendment. From an attorney perspective, the text of the Second Amendment is incredibly poorly written, to be honest. The Second Amendment says, a well-regulated militia, comma, being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, comma, shall not be infringed. And honestly, when I look at this text, I kind of say, wow, we definitely could have used a little clarification here. In general, I think courts have consistently agreed this is talking about the right of the people to keep and bear arms. But what this well-regulated militia means, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. So if we just take out that phrase, being necessary to the security of a free state, it would say a well-regulated militia, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, comma, shall not be infringed. So again, it kind of begs the question, are we supposed to be able to have a militia? Are we supposed to be able to do certain things? And so I think to really understand this, we have to look to what the intent of the Second Amendment was, to understand what the founders were looking at doing, why they included this in there, and why did they feel it necessary to throw in a Second Amendment about guns and what was taking place. Michael, do you have any insights into any of that?
Yeah, just a little quick history. Before the Revolutionary War even took place, obviously tensions weren't great between Britain and the colonies. And King George actually tried to instill a piece of gun control. He tried to remove the Americans' access to guns, firearms, gunpowder. This is 1774 and 75, and just to confiscate it by force. This obviously happened after the 1773 Boston Tea Party, so it's kind of in response to that. So their first step to kind of quell the trouble was to just take away their gun. And this was not received very well. There was a lot of pushback to that. People hid their weapons. Obviously, as you see in the Revolutionary War, most of the citizenry had weapons and were able to employ those as part of the war. And it's actually a big help to win the battle, in that the British military was really well trained, and there was a lot of them, and they could deploy all over the place. But what they found is every time they deployed to a different area in the colonies, there was always a militia there ready and waiting for them, because everybody was armed and they were able to throw together militias really quickly. And this was a really important part of winning the Revolutionary War for America. And it's something that the founding fathers took note of. They thought it was very important that people be armed and can fight for their country. Hamilton said, if circumstances should at any time oblige the government to form an army of any magnitude, that army can never be formidable to the liberties of the people while there is a large body of citizens, little, if at all, inferior to them in discipline and the use of arms, who stand ready to defend their own rights and those of their fellow citizens. This appears to me to be the only substitute that can be devised for a standing army and the best possible security against it if it should exist. They felt that having citizens armed was one of the greatest checks to a central power having a standing army, such as in the case of the British with their well-trained army. And so it was very important to the founding fathers that every citizen be armed. And in their view, that was how their victory was won. That was how they were able to maintain their freedom, was having citizens armed in response to a large standing military.
And it's interesting to look at, because maybe one reason we struggle reading the text today is because we don't experience things the same way. We haven't seen a militia. Generally, we're concerned if we see groups of people with weapons outside of the police or the army. We have a lot of faith and trust in them. That's been challenged in American culture in the last little bit. On different sides will, take stabs or support at or with different government groups, police groups, military, and things. But in general, I think American society has a lot of trust for those institutions, at least as respect to them and how they're treated. But I am interested by this notion in the Second Amendment, where it doesn't just say any militia shall not be infringed. It actually says a well-regulated militia. And now again, today, I don't even think we have things to necessarily look at to compare that to. But I think the point is more that the founders envisioned there being some form of control or supervision or regulation of some sort. Regulation may not mean the same thing then that it does now in the sense of law or rule with it. But I do think that, to me, it strikes at what we're talking about with the balance of liberty is they weren't necessarily saying anything goes, because there's a balance in trying to understand how to strike these things, or in how to a balance in understanding how to reconcile these competing interests. And they took a stab at some of that, where there was necessary to have some form of regulation, some form of control, some form of order or moral, morality associated with what was taking place. And so that goes in a little bit to this right to keep and bear arms. And they're honestly, so in the last, 20 or so years in America, there's been quite a bit of lawsuits over gun regulations. But before that, there wasn't a lot. There were some, but not a lot. And it's been interesting to see the growth, where certainly we have things that are very troubling, heartbreaking to see, when active shooter goes into a school, shoots children or other things. These are scenarios that tug at our heartstrings. They're scenarios that make most people want to do something. We don't want evil to prevail. We want children to be protected. All these good desires that come. And then many people get frustrated and angry, feeling that the Constitution is an impediment to banning guns, for example, or stopping these harms from happening. And I think it's important as we go through this to really make sure that we recognize there are deep concerns, deep impacts to families and people that have occurred because of guns or because of how people use guns. But the fact that guns exist have changed the nature of the world quite a bit. And it's interesting to talk about whether the world's better or worse off because of guns. And one of the things that perhaps they've helped with, because even as I go back through, I guess, sorry, before I do that, recently the Supreme Court in 2022 had a case where they overturned some of New York's prohibitions on issuing permits for people to have a gun in public or even in private. New York said you had to have a need beyond just a general self-defense desire to be able to get a permit for a gun. And the Supreme Court, when they looked at it, came back and said, you know, if you're going to justify a gun regulation, you have to do it in context of something that's been in place historically, something that the founders accepted. I think it's kind of going back to this principle of this well-regulated militia. The founders accepted that certain types of regulations may be necessary, but there was a balance trying to be struck. And so the court said, essentially, my reading of it is, yeah, we don't fully know where the balance is. We don't fully know what the principle is. So we're going to look back to the founders to see their wisdom. And so look back to history. You have to justify a gun regulation based in a regulation that existed throughout American history, or some time around that time period. And so it's interesting that now the battle over guns has turned to a look at history and to look at what regulations were in place. So now the history experts may be the ones that help decide what happens with the debate over guns in courts. And I think it's important to note that because as a society, it's very difficult to know sometimes exactly where the balance is. I think there are principles at play that if you think about a basketball, if you take a basketball and spin it on your finger, as you practice spinning it, it's difficult. You know where you're supposed to put it. You want to put it in the middle of where the ball's spinning and hold it there. It takes practice to get there, but if you think about trying to balance an object that's not symmetrical, an object that's kind of unwieldy and all over the place, it takes a lot of work to find that balance point. And for some of these principles, we as a society are still working on finding the proper balance point and trying to find where the highest level of liberty is created. Because to go back to the question of it, is the world better off because of guns or worse off because of guns? Obviously, we're hypothesizing some, but here's a couple things to think about. Prior to guns being invented, people had bows, arrows, and swords. For the most part, I mean, they had some clubs and rocks or whatever, but most combat was hand to hand, and kings could rule simply because they could have more people, more sword power, more archers and things. And the world stayed in a place where kings ruled for quite some time. The powerful could maintain power with the weapons that existed. When guns came on the scene, it started to make it so that colonies like those in America would take on the big superpowers. They felt a little bit more justified in taking on and kind of leveling the playing field against these big powers. As they did, and as guns became more advanced, guns were used to topple a lot of existing power centers. And many countries and colonies and people gained freedom. they put constitutions in place during this time period. Now, could they have done it with swords? That's where we hypothesize some. And I say, well, for thousands of years, they didn't really pull it off with swords alone. Because if you were an average citizen trying to fight against a trained soldier and it's hand-to-hand combat and it depends on your skill and strength, chances weren't great for you. And it seemed that history repeatedly favored the kings that had the swords versus the peasants that had to try and figure out how to create one themselves. And so guns kind of helped level the playing field in that regard. Another place that I think often gets overlooked in the discussion about guns is in looking at the fact that for as long as we know, women haven't had equal rights prior to, the last, I don't know, 100 years or so, when it just kind of started to really work towards that with right to vote, different things, where women were often relegated to a role of, depending on a man, having to have a man help survive. And one reason for that is because historically, men were stronger and could do most whatever they wanted with a woman. If it was a male versus a female, and that was it, no other weapons involved, it was a very difficult place for women to be. And so in a world of hand-to-hand combat, in a world of not having tools to help level the playing field, so to speak, women didn't have rights. And it's interesting to me to look at the fact that women gained rights in a scenario where they also gained a stronger ability to defend themselves, where the weapons became such that it helped level the playing field. If a woman pointed a gun at a man, she could stop him. She now had something of force that was concerning to that man. And so as we look at the level of equality that we've reached, I believe strongly we have to remember in that guns have helped level the playing field for women. I don't think there's any beating around that bush to say that that's not a part of it. We're not just a society where we can just pass a law and everyone listens to it. There's other factors at play. Even the police using guns and others having the ability to come in and do things has helped make it so that we've pulled out of a situation where it's just strength versus strength, which is kind of the anarchy state, to a state of some more balance where there is this leveling of a playing field. If we took away all guns, I know even in fairly safe neighborhoods that I live in or around, and even associating with women who are pretty independent, pretty equal, doing a lot of things, many of them are still afraid to go out alone at night. They know that there's still a threat to the fact that not all men are trustworthy, not all men are thinking appropriate things. And if they do, some like to have a dog or some kind of self-defense system with them. But I think about a country where if we just took away all guns today, what would happen to those women? How much more unsafe would it become? And again, we're hypothesizing some. Some people scoff at that and go, wouldn't change anything. To which I reply, well, I guess you don't know the same guy as I do. I don't know, because there are bad things and desires that go on. And if we look at history, I don't trust that men have fully overcome all their animal instincts or their lower nature, you could say. So those are a couple pieces to think about. But also on the flip side, there is violence. There are unnecessary deaths that happen. There are people that use guns in anger. They use guns to gain power over people, to shoot and to kill. And so it'd be interesting, Michael, to know some of the numbers in America on gun ownership, gun violence, talk through some of those different things as we look at these issues.
Sure. Yeah. On the note of the kind of gun violence side, what's interesting to notice sometimes when people look at America and its gun violence, they think that there's more violence in America than elsewhere in the world, and it's really not true. Assault, if you just look at assault, is actually lower in America than a lot of places in the world. What the difference is, deadly assault is higher here because more assault takes place in America with guns than in other areas of the world. And it's not the highest. There's other countries that have higher rates of shooting, far higher rates of shooting in some aspects. But because so much assault in America takes place with a weapon, assault in America tends to be deadlier. Whereas the rate of assault in America isn't higher. It's actually on the lower side as opposed to other areas of the world. But typically, if you look at the EU and Britain, assault there is actually quite a bit higher than it is in America. It's just not deadly. They don't use guns as often as they do here. And that's probably due partly to just sheer volume. If you look at figuring out the number of guns in America is a tricky thing. And this can probably also go towards the discussion of why it might be a tricky thing to limit gun ownership. But guns aren't just sold as a whole piece. People will build their own weapons. Parts are sold. People will get parts together and build their own guns. You can 3D print guns today. So knowing the exact total of weapons in America is a really difficult thing to know. But they're estimating somewhere between 300 to 400 million civilian-owned guns in America. So that's generally more than the population. More weapons here than the population of America. What's interesting is today, maybe 2021, roughly 30% of the population owned guns. So 30% of Americans own some 300 to 400 million weapons is what's estimated. It's interesting because in 1990, it was about 50% of the population owned a weapon. And that's down from previous years as well. Gun ownership per person continues to drop. But the total number of weapons continues to grow. The majority of guns sold in the US are handguns, as in pistols, revolvers. It's about 57%, which is also very different from in the early, before 1990. Before 1990, it was usually the long guns, the rifles that were outselling the handguns. People were more interested in guns for sport, for hunting. Today, the interest is far more in the realm of self-defense, at least as polling, if you look at polling data. The reason people usually give when they're purchasing a gun is self-defense. That means that the smaller pistols are far more popular than they used to be. So what's being largely sold in America is the pistols, the revolvers. There's some statistics on this are really difficult to kind of sort through, but there's some statistics that show that gun sales and gun deaths tend to grow together. And they do kind of when there's spikes, but gun sales from 1990 until mid, 2015 or something grew quite a lot, while gun deaths shrank quite a lot. And then I think is well known during COVID 2020, 2021, gun deaths spiked really, really high, seeing numbers higher than they've ever seen in America. And so if you look at over time, you could say that as the number of guns increased, deaths increased. But if you look at the period of time between 1990 and 2015, it's actually the opposite relationship. So people like to say there's more death from more guns. I think the evidence is mixed. And there's also no causal relationship there. We don't know if people are buying more weapons to commit more crimes, or if more crimes are being committed because of more weapons. There's just really no good causal link. But in regards to the spike in deaths in 2021, this was the first time that gun deaths were higher than deaths by car accident. So gun deaths get a lot of attention, but it's only been recently, last couple of years, that they've actually been higher than deaths by car accident. Also of note, at least as far as 2021, 54% of all gun deaths are suicide. It's also something not talked about as much, and that proportion has been higher in the past. With the spike in homicides in 2020 and 2021, it's gone down a little bit, but it's been over 60% in the past of gun deaths are by suicide. And so I guess that's kind of some of the numbers behind what we're seeing today. One more note on homicides in 2021. It's the largest number of homicides by gun that we've seen, but it's not the largest rate. So if you look per capita, it's, what was the number? Per capita, gun deaths were 14.6 people per 100,000 people. 14.6 per 100,000 people was the gun deaths in 2021. The highest that we've seen in America was in 1974, which was 16.3 people per 100,000. So the total number is something that's focused on a lot because it's a high number, but it's actually not a higher rate than we've ever seen in America. And so if you look at from 1974 to today, and you say about the same rate of people are dying, and yet today the issue is a lot hotter than it's ever been. Maybe we're missing some historical context to what we're seeing.
Yeah, and I think that's real interesting to look at, and it's a really sad thing to think about the suicide side of things. And did you say 54% of those numbers are suicides?
Yeah, 54% 2021. It's been above 60% in years past. So most gun deaths are suicide.
Wow. Because that is an interesting number to split out to say, is this something that's hurting another person where a person's using force on another person? Or is it harm to self that we're talking about? To me, both are very sad, but it's, I think, intellectually honest to talk about the two in different buckets because we're talking about two very different scenarios, two very different issues. To talk about suicide or talk about violence of one person against another. You made the point at the start that America has lower rates of assault, but that it tends to be more deadly here. And I think some people would argue to say that's exactly why we need gun regulation to keep more people alive. Just because violence happens doesn't mean we should make it easier to kill someone. And so that's a piece that people will throw out and say, hey, these other countries don't have a lot of guns. But going back to this 2022 case from the US Supreme Court with New York City, when they say, well, let's look to the history, one of the things that we have to realize in America is we have 300 to 400 million guns out there. Is there any possible way to confiscate them, to take them? Is this an issue that the law can completely address at this point? Because there's just so much of it. I know I was in Taiwan for a few years and they don't allow guns there. But they're also a small island with no land owners, neighboring landowner borders or anything. And they could start out taking guns and keeping it that way. And so the military has guns and everyone serves in the military. But I think that their historical background is very different than our historical background.
And if you look just really quickly at what's going on with drug trafficking in the US, drugs by and large are illegal, and yet we can't seem to keep them out of the country. And today it's illegal for the most part, to bring in guns from outside the country. But the US manufacturers make so many, people don't really care. If that were to stop, I'm just hypothesizing a world where there is no gun production in America. It seems like with the current trends, how are you going to keep them out? We're not able to do very well with the drugs. They're getting in like crazy. And with technology available today to make your own, it seems a tough sell to think you can just stop that.
Yeah, it's a great point, because if you look at the drug trade, if we banned guns, would they just become the next drug commodity? And to some extent they are in some countries. And they're obviously a tool, useful for both bad and good. And so people then demand it. And this gets us into a little bit of exploring some of what the Second Amendment is trying to accomplish, this balance. Because one of the things I do look at in society right now is what happens when a new power comes out. Talking technological power, firepower, bomb power, planes. We often talk about, well, the founders wanted an armed citizenry to help keep a check on the government. And then it begs the question now, well, if the government has tanks, if they've got fighter jets and helicopters and all kinds of bombs and explosives that do way more than we can possibly do, are guns really necessary to help put a check and balance in place on the government at this point?
And it's a really good question, because you just say, hey, if the government wants to take me in and I resist them with my best gun I can get, and they show up at my door with a tank, what am I going to do? They're going to bring me in. But I think the question is probably a deeper one. Instead of looking at the individual versus the government, there's a lot of things in play for an individual to be able to fight back against a government, at least to have that check and balance, right? But a lot of it is based on community. It's down to your neighborhood, your city, your state, working together with other people to try to maintain checks and balances and liberty. And I think it was intended to be that way. So if you look at what can your community do armed with rudimentary weapons, regular old rifles, versus the government and their, we were looking at the nuclear warheads that the U.S. government has. I think it came out to be some 5,200 nuclear warheads. Estimates are one of them is dropped on New York. Some 600,000 people will die. What is the community going to do against that? We can probably look to history a little bit to try to figure out what the answer to that is. We can look at the British Empire controlled a quarter of the world's territory and ruled 1/4 of the Earth's population in 1922. So even as far as 1922, they still ruled a lot of the world. In that year, they were forced to exit from one of their oldest colonies, Ireland. And in Ireland, there's a determined group of men who made the country basically ungovernable. They had weapons, and they just made it so that the British government couldn't govern them. They could have deployed their entire navy, blocking the island, starving out the rebellion. But I'm going to quote this here, they were unwilling to pay the moral price or the price in blood. It was precisely this foreseeable event that has caused the British to ban Irish Catholics from possessing firearms hundreds of years earlier. So when it comes to government trying to manage a people, they will take into account the moral and manpower costs of implementing the rules and laws on a people. If a government wants to rule a state that has gone rogue, theoretically, they could drop a whole lot of nuclear bombs on it. And then what do they have left to govern at that point? Governments need something to govern. And they also are concerned about, particularly in the world today, what their actions can be viewed as outside of the country. And so there is a moral and a manpower cost to every decision they have to make, even if they far outstrip a group of people. The few people with the weapons can actually make a big difference. And another great example is Ukraine and Russia. Lots of Ukraine success. Now, this isn't to say either one side is right or wrong. This is just to analyze what's going on. Ukraine has actually had a lot of success against Russia. Some people want to pin it on Russia's ineptitude. Other people want to point out the fact that Ukrainians are armed, and it's a lot of the people standing up with the weapons that they have. And it's making just a huge problem for Russia, because Russia isn't interested in going in and just destroying Ukraine. They're seeking to govern. And so theoretically, they could just drop nuclear bombs on it and have done. But Ukraine's putting up quite the fight against this massive power in Russia. America in Afghanistan and Iraq has probably one of the most popular failed military enterprises there's been. The massive power of America couldn't take down Afghanistan or Iraq. They pulled out. The people living there have won with rudimentary rifles and homemade explosives. It's not usually about the one versus the government. It's usually about community and what a group of people can do and what cost the ruling power is willing to put into squash a rebellion.
Yeah. And I think it's real interesting to look to some of these examples of America going with all their firepower, maybe not all their firepower, but a lot of their firepower against Afghanistan. And after, 20 years, pulling out and it just collapsing in an instant, what they tried to set up. And they were never fully successful. They never fully took things over. Because there is this aspect of some notion that people have to opt in to be governed. There's some level of consent, and America certainly embraces that there has to be consent at some level. Again, people are going to not consent to certain laws or certain things, but as a whole, they're choosing America and its system over other things. And so governments do have the problem, even with intense firepower, of sure, they could just obliterate everyone, but if they want to govern or rule, what does it take to make that happen? And if people have basic weapons, it radically changes that that approach and how they go about that. And so I think that is interesting. And again, just going back to this notion of, are guns necessary? Well, maybe that's not quite the right question. Do guns, if we phrase it this way, do guns help level the playing field for individuals, for groups, for communities, for females versus male, for citizen versus government? The answer is probably yes. Now, again, do guns, for example, make it easier for someone to commit violence and kill somebody? I think the answer is probably yes to that too. People talk about with violence that they'll say, well, violence is going to happen no matter what. Guns don't make or break violence. They don't make people more or less violent. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. There's knives. People can attack with knives. They can attack with their cars. They can do a whole bunch of different things. But one of the differences between a knife attack and a gun attack is that the person with the knife has to put themselves in a lot more risk and harm's way if they're going to get close enough to a person to attack them with a knife. Versus the gun allows you to stay back. You can keep people from you. You can use it both as kind of a shield and a sword in a sense to attack and have some protection, because people can't get close to you unless they have a gun as well. Now, so I guess I say that because to me, guns do make it easier for people to commit deadly violence. I will full up say that. I also look at guns and say, there's this question about whether the government can regulate guns or not. People will argue about that, and I just kind of say, we're well past the stage of deciding whether or not the government can regulate guns. The only battles we're arguing over right now is where we draw the line, what's happening. We decided a long time ago that average citizens shouldn't have a machine gun. And there's a couple exceptions to that where people can own a machine gun. But in general, average citizens can't get access to a machine gun. Those are reserved for armies and things. And again, those are situations where you are on a battlefield and there's troops coming across. They're trying to land troops, they're trying to do things. Those machine guns are used in those types of situations, but for most Americans with self-defense needs, you don't need a machine gun if someone's entering your home. You're not going to pack a machine gun in your backpack and whip it out if someone jumps you on a trail or something like that. There's other options that allow the same thing to happen, the same protections to be in place. But again, I think it's important to note that when we talk about balance, we talk about the Second Amendment itself, it talks about this well-regulated aspect. And again, I don't mean that. I don't think that means that we can just have whatever regulations are necessary on guns. But I do think it is appropriate to talk about regulations and if they do something or if they don't do something. Because one of the things is that, if we look at 2021 with its increase in gun violence, we can also recognize that in 2021, America had an incredible number of gun laws in place. And so then there's the question of, did that help the gun violence? Meaning, would it have been twice as high as it was without it? Or is gun violence happening regardless? Kind of like drugs. Drugs are illegal. A lot of people say, give up the war on drugs. You're not doing anything, America. And I look at it and say, well, I don't think you can say that America's not doing anything. I think that there's been a lot of drugs stopped. A lot of things happen. And so I don't know if it's entirely fair to say that the regulations haven't done a thing, but they also certainly have not stopped gun violence, just as the laws haven't stopped the drug trade. These things still take place. And so if there are still guns coming in, and there is still gun violence taking place, are we better off to take guns away from the law-abiding citizens or not? And I look at that and say, I don't believe we're better off at all to lose our ability to have equal power, equal grounds with people. Even if I don't have a gun, the risk to the person that I have a gun is fairly high. And so it's still, because there are gun owners out there, it still makes it so that those that don't own guns have a higher level of protection and safety, simply because they might own a gun. And I would think that most Americans would be very opposed to being required by law to put a sign out in their front yard that says, we're a gun-free home. And I think the opposition to that stems from the fact that Americans know implicitly that they are benefiting to some extent from those that own guns. Otherwise, if you're opposed to guns, you just put out a sign and say, hey, look at us, we're the moral right, we're a gun-free home. Why don't people do that? Because then you become a target in a country where there are guns and things taking place. And so again, when we look at this balance, there are pros, there are cons, but that's part of the balance. We have to figure out, where is society best off?
And to just add maybe some numbers to what you're saying, we talk about, should we remove guns from law-abiding citizens? If you look at rates of gun deaths in the U.S. by area, typically the areas with the lowest regulations kind of have the highest rates of gun death, unless you divide out the suicides and the homicides. So, for example, Washington, D.C. doesn't appear at the top of the list on total gun deaths, but they are at the top of the list on homicides by gun. Washington, D.C. is a gun-free zone, basically. Not allowed to have guns there. So if you want to talk about, like you said earlier, maybe we should talk about differences between suicide and homicide. What danger is inflicted on you by a gun law from somebody else versus what danger you might inflict on yourself? And so suicides versus homicides kind of give us an insight into that. Also, it's kind of a hard thing to document, but there are studies that have tried to determine how often guns are used in a self-defense way. The CDC reported in 2013 that they estimated somewhere between 500,000 and 3 million uses of guns for self-defense per year, which is very high. That's a lot of uses per year of a weapon in a manner of self-defense. Another survey was conducted in 2021 they estimated the number to be somewhere about 1.6 million, which is, between that 500 and that 3 million. And so to just look at the casualty versus not looking at the positive side of, well, are they effective at all? Then we wouldn't be doing any justice to the topic. We should be discussing both sides and trying to decide. And I think this is what should encourage us to be more principle focused. Should we be trying to split hairs and say, well, when deaths reach this number, we should start taking guns away? And who decides that number? Or should we say, what is the principle of governance we should seek to live by? And should there be some things we do on the legal side? And then do we need to take responsibility as citizens for the kind of communities that we build?
Yeah, and I think some people struggle knowing fully with responsibility with communities and things. But I think back to things like even the basic scouting program. There was so much teaching that took place as to respectful gun ownership, to morality associated with it. People talk often about how they would go to school with a gun in the back of the pickup truck. It was just what you did. No one batted an eye at that because there was a teaching, there was a culture associated with it. Now it feels to me like guns are becoming more of a taboo subject where people are saying, I'm more moral not having one. Maybe you are or aren't. I'm not casting judgment on that, but then to say, but how do you help there be a moral discussion about proper gun ownership? One that's interesting to me to look at right now is this discussion about whether parents should secure their guns at home, because there seems to be a number of instances where children are taking those guns and parents are starting to be prosecuted for it. So we have a case out of Michigan, I think, where the parents are being prosecuted because the son went to school called and said, hey, parents, come pick your kid up, have a discussion with us. The parents went in and had a discussion. Nobody knew there was a gun in the kid's bag at this point, but the parents refused to take the kid home that day. They said, oh, we've got work and other things we have to do. The kid eventually pulls out the gun, shoots some people. He had gotten it from his parents. And the other one was the sixth grader, or not the sixth grader, the first grader, the 6-year-old, who took his mother's gun to school, I think, and shot his first grade teacher in the stomach. These are scenarios where the law of liability, responsibility is trying to say, you can be responsible for that. And people are starting to act, and I've noticed a significant uptick in the number of people talking about responsible gun ownership and people talking about safes and the fingerprint technology that makes it so you can still open your safe incredibly quickly. You can still defend yourself if a burglar breaks in. And I remember even just seeing a couple days ago on the news, there was a scenario where a guy rings on an apartment doorbell. I think there's a Ring camera or something. The people in the apartment start talking to the guy as if they're not home. And the guy says, oh, I'm just here to replace some air filters. They're going, no, you don't need to do that right now. Move on. And the guy's going, no, I really need to come in. And they said, well, we're not home. He goes, okay, I'll try and stop back tomorrow. And then as soon as he hangs up on the Ring doorbell, he starts trying to kick their door down, and another guy joins him with a mask on. They're just going through trying to find people not home, essentially. And these guys in the apartment pull out a gun and start shooting through the door because these guys are about to break in. They don't hit the guys. They can't see where they're at necessarily. So the guys run off, but they shoot a bunch of bullets through their door. And again, I look at that and I think, yeah, that's a scenario where the people being attacked didn't have to put themselves in harm's way. They didn't have to pull out a knife or a bat and try and physically defend themselves. But they were able to protect themselves. We don't know if the people breaking in had guns or not. But, and obviously for every one of those scenarios, you can have a scenario on the other side where someone is violent and bad with it. But it goes back to this balance of, well, consider what would our country be like if we took them away? does gun ownership do something for rights and liberties? Does it create a healthy tension between citizenry and the government, or an unhealthy tension? The founders, I believe, felt it created a healthy tension, one that was necessary to keep government in check. And question is, does it still keep that healthy tension in place, or has something changed in society? I think it's a valid question to ask. Has something changed? To say, is it now unhealthy? Are there bad aspects to what's taking place? One interesting law to look at as we talk about gun ownership and this balance is, I think in 2005, maybe, the federal government passed a law that said that gun manufacturers couldn't be held liable if a gun was used to kill somebody, unless they had an exception to it, unless there'd been some kind of marketing or advertising campaign. And so since then, Texas passed a law that allowed private citizens to sue abortion providers if they conducted an abortion. It was an attempt to get the Supreme Court to overturn Roe versus Wade. And to me, the law was a very bad step forward, in the sense of, whenever you do something legally that's, whether you feel it's good or bad, it opens the door on the other side, because the law is kind of just, it's kind of blind, just in the sense of has to treat like situations like, and it's just there. It doesn't have a lot of morality to it. It doesn't have a lot of looking at whether it's good or bad, the precedents that come. And so when this precedent goes out for abortion providers to be sued, California, as the Supreme Court's coming down with this case that says, yeah, you can't really ban these guns unless you look to the historical nature of them. California says, well, we'll just do what Texas did. We'll let any citizen sue if their loved one's killed by a gun or shot, because they need to become responsible for these things. And they went expressly under this exemption in the federal law that allows for liability in situations where there's advertising associated with it. And they allege that, so these claims come out that the advertising encourages someone to buy a gun, or, I don't know, all the different takes they have on it. But we're at a place where the gun manufacturers, if these lawsuits are allowed to proceed, could literally be put out of business here in America. And so that battle's still playing out in the courts, but it comes back to this thing of, but what does that do for America ultimately? There is a tool that has hurt people, but has it built more than it's hurt? And even if it has built more than it hurts, are there appropriate, well-regulated ways for the law to reduce that, or is it purely a citizen aspect of it? And I think these are some questions we need to be willing to honestly ask, to say, are there some regulations that may help reduce gun violence? The answer is probably. And does every regulation mean that we're going to completely lose our freedoms? No, because I would submit to anyone out there that doesn't want any regulation on guns whatsoever. No regulations on guns means anarchy. If we're in a state of anarchy, that will be exploited quickly. There will be all kinds of things that happen that will make it so people come screaming for intense regulation. And even right now in America, with the things that are happening, whereas as a society, we're not having the discussions, the teachings on gun ownership and morality and things associated with it as much. We are reaching a place where the damage from that, people are screaming for more regulation, for more help, for more involvement from the government. Now, again, just passing a law doesn't necessarily mean that it will improve. We may lose more rights. We may start to lose a lot of things. But if we as a society don't self-regulate to some way, and really decrease some of these things, if we as a society don't self-regulate and get gun safes with the fingerprint technology that's in place, we could be facing a scenario where, well, there's been so many shootings and so many situations that at some point America says enough is enough. We're going to do more. We're going to regulate more. Now, obviously, the Supreme Court would have to evaluate that and look at that. But generally, the more that something happens, the more deaths there are, the more compelling the government interest becomes, even in overriding a constitutional right. And so, in looking at guns and ownership, there's an intense need to self-regulate. There's an intense need to start to look at these and to be very responsible, to make it so that, probably make it so that your kids just can't grab them whenever, or kids have been properly trained, they're properly vetted. You know, a kid might need access to a gun to defend themselves at home if you're not home. But are these things that you can train, you can teach, you can take responsibility for? And are there ways, are there associations, are there groups that can help with that? Can gun stores start to impose some form of training or regulation to help with this? The more that America can self-regulate, the less the law will step in to do it. And to me, it's a question to ask, a question to look at, because if we only sit here and argue about, do guns hurt people? You know, some people say it's not the gun, it's the human. It's true, it's the human behind it. But does the gun make it much safer and easier for someone to harm another person? Yes, absolutely. But again, that plays then on both sides. If it makes it safer and easier for someone to harm another, that also makes it safer and easier for someone to defend themselves, for women to have equality, for citizens to have overthrown tyrants in the past in these scenarios. And so we're playing with something that anything good can be used for bad, anything bad can be used for good. Tools are by their nature tools. And again, the government has a lot of firepower. We don't have access to it all as citizens. I don't think there's a lot of people that credibly argue that every citizen should have the right to have a nuclear bomb because the government has a nuclear bomb, or we should all have the right to Apache helicopters or F-16s or whatever else it is. There is something we've put in place, which also begs another question with the Second Amendment. The government, or the founders, allowed guns to be used as a check on the government. But we don't really have checks we've put in place from a systematic government checks and balance type approach to how the government can or should use the extensive firepower it has. In America, for example, if you look at the number of bombs America drops across the world each year, it's quite insane. There's a significant number of bombs that America drops around the world, in conflicts in Africa, Syria, other countries. And there's not a lot of great checks and balances in place. To some countries, America is kind of like a terrorist. They're dropping bombs, beating them up, doing things. Other people in the countries look at America as a hero. They're to fight for them. But there's always two sides to a dispute. And countless bombs have been dropped. Countless buildings exploded and blown up. And all the debate about the First or the Second Amendment, I don't see a lot of discussion about what checks and balances do we need to put in place to counter the firepower the government has. Because to me, that's one of the core principles in the Second Amendment, is that at the beginning it was like firepower with like firepower. As the firepower significantly progressed, people quickly let go of the notion that every citizen should have access to that. And then what do we do at that point? How do we balance that? How do we have a check in place? And is the Second Amendment sufficient as it stands, or do we need to put a few more checks and balances in place on the government? So these are some of the things I think we should talk about as a society. We should look at, start to say, yeah, when should the government be able to drop a bomb on another country? that we're not even at war with. Why do we do these things? Why do we go here? What's taking place? To look at some of those questions.
Just some of those numbers. In 2021, the U.S. dropped, this is bombs and missiles, 554 on Iraq and Syria, 801 on Afghanistan, 4,428 on Yemen, that most people don't even know we're bombing Yemen. And then another 1,500 on other areas, other countries. That was just in 2021.
And that's pretty crazy. Look at over 4,000 bombs in Yemen. And I'll admit, I have no idea what dispute's going on in Yemen. I don't know. The news hasn't made a big deal about it. I don't hear people arguing for the U.S. to pull out of Yemen. I don't know what's going on there. But as I looked at the history of bombs dropped, I found some chart somewhere once that showed all the countries. We've bombed an incredible number of countries in the world. And there's a lot of firepower with that. And that in America, our government is still representative of us as citizens. And do we have some responsibility to say, hey, government, we want some accountability. Can't just go drop bombs on countries. We need to know what's going on. We need to have a check and balance in place here, because that's ultimately representative of us as a people, because we still self-govern, we still vote people into office. And so to me, as we talk about the balance and as we talk about freedom and liberty, we don't want the wild, wild west where people can just go shoot whoever they want to shoot. I don't think anyone wants that. But we have a tool that exists, to Michael's point. We can 3D print them. We can create all kinds of scenarios. They can be bought and sold in parts. They can be made. They're not something that requires intense technology to even make. The founding fathers made them. It's not something that is crazy difficult to do once you know some of the basics about how they work. And so again, as society progresses, as we learn things and do things, we are caught in situations where there's a tool that exists. How do we best approach it? And I think with any law that we look at, we need to be very wise about saying, does this help bring us out of anarchy into a place of well-regulated? Or is it something that's now taking away rights, pushing us further down this aspect of throwing off the balance America struck? But recognizing from a bigger picture perspective that guns have likely done far more to maintain a certain pushback against the natural inclination towards tyranny that happens when people have laws, when they have access to laws and power, and they make those. It becomes very easy to want to fix all situations through the law. And we have to remember, even the law is not powerful enough to fix all situations. The law cannot stop all harm. And so we can't sit here and go, well, because someone died, we have to pass a law. That's a false argument, because people die, people will die. The law is powerless to stop that in and of itself. What the law can do is create a scenario where there's a more appropriate balance. And we'll have to deal consistently in society with the fact that people die at times. It's inevitable. It's impossible to avoid. Certainly heartbreaking, but it's one that we have to look at and be honest about, I think, as we look at some of these things. So wrapping that up, we'll let Michael share a few thoughts.
Yeah, sorry to jump in there. Just along those same lines, what we see a lot is emotional response to things that happen. And what interested me a lot about the debates about laws on guns was just the amount of information out there that people disagreed on. One side would say one thing, one side would say another. And so a lot of these arguments are being made emotionally, and then they're just finding the piece of data that seems to fit with what they want. This is on all sides of the argument, and then just running with it with a lot of emotion. And I think if we could recognize that emotion on both sides, there's heartbreaking loss to gun violence, and then there's so many examples of guns actually working for the betterment of our society. And there's a lot of emotional attachment to that. If we could recognize that and try to come to a place where we're saying, let's stop calling one side or the other the killers. Let's see if we can work together to come together to, find a good solution here. But we're too often pointing the finger at the side that disagrees with us as though they're the ones that are causing the issue. I don't know that anybody who are trying to make these laws are out there to try to get people killed. Generally, we want to help people. I think that's kind of a general idea for people in America. And so we can lose a little bit of the emotion as far as my opponent is causing this issue. And maybe we can find some of these pieces of data that we can come to an agreement on and realize that there's good and bad things happening both ways. Then maybe we can decide this piece is for the government and this piece is for society. We can ask society to step up, do what they need to do. We can ask the government to step up and do what they need to do. But so much of it's just driven on emotion that it's really hard to come to consensus because there's so much information out there.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point because we certainly like to talk about some of the data as we look at things, but ultimately all data can be cherry picked to support your beliefs. And this is an important principle to understand, that we'll go through and find data that supports what we believe. I think it's one we'll talk about often, but in trying to be open-minded and actually seek truth, it's very difficult in a world of tons of data, because even the data itself, when it's collected, can be people had an agenda to get it, to put it together. And trying to find out information based solely on numbers alone is problematic, but it's also problematic from the perspective of trying to inform regulation through numbers. There may be a couple times where that's important to do, but regulation law should always start with principle. It should always start. Now, the numbers may show us if our principle's off. Maybe our principles aren't working. Maybe there's some breakdown in what we believed or anticipated. But simply saying, oh, a lot of people have died by car accidents mean we need stricter car laws. The two don't necessarily correlate. Maybe we do need stricter car laws. Maybe it shows us that, but the one may not cause the other. And things can still happen where, even with COVID, coming out of COVID, you look at the rates of the number of speeding tickets of people caught going over 100 miles an hour, it skyrocketed, at least here in Utah. And the police were trying to figure out why so many people were driving so fast after COVID. Some people theorized, well, maybe it's because the roads, there's less people on the roads, so they can get up to higher speeds. Maybe people are pent up about being, together or whatever, but I don't think it's fair to say that COVID necessarily caused intense speeding. We don't fully understand what was taking place, but there could have been a spike in society. But if you just take that number and cherry pick it and say, oh, speeding's up, we better do something about it legally, we may be missing the underlying cause and the underlying issue. And so yes, I really like what you say too about not demonizing the other side, to say both sides see something. They're acting on something. They're trying to improve America through this. And this is one of the aspects of liberty, why liberty is so essential, is that discussion, the involvement with saying, okay, you see that, you see that. Where's the balance? Where's the middle? Because that's kind of where liberty is. Not necessarily a compromise place of we both give up something, but more a place of saying, how do we reach a place where the different interests and principles actually are balanced, where we can account for this principle and account for that principle and let both coexist together on this balance, on this scale, like the picture we have. And that is a place where we get to great strength. And that's what makes America the magical nation that it is. We've worked at that for so many years in the past, and we shouldn't lose that, even with issues that are as deep and as important as gun regulations or the Second Amendment, to be able to go into this, talk to people, recognize, yeah, bad things happen, and recognize, yeah, the gun doesn't fire itself. Sure, there's a human behind it, but it sure makes it easier for the people to do it. The rates of death in assault is higher in countries where they have a lot more guns than other countries. But also, what do we have? Now, again, on the flip side, some of the things we've mentioned, some people may say, well, women in England don't have to fear any more than women here in America. And so you can look at some of these things and start to say, well, let's look at other countries, let's look at scenarios and situations. But to do an honest evaluation of that, there's an intense amount of culture that has to be looked at. There's an intense amount of knowledge of looking at the police structure, the force they have in place, the regulations they have in place, how pervasive those are or aren't. Because ultimately, every police force I know of in every country still relies on guns. And they still have that to enforce things and to go after people. And so the guns still form the basis of, this threat of guns, or guns really helps with a lot of that. But again, would America be worse off? Would there be more violence if we didn't have guns? That's a hypothesis. That's something we're putting out. And some people will pull out numbers and say, this country didn't, so we'd be fine too. Other countries, you can look at countries like Switzerland, which has incredibly high rates of gun ownership, but incredibly low amounts of gun violence, and say, well, what are they doing as a society? What are they doing culturally? How do they do these things? Because maybe that's part of it, is to go to this cultural balance. And so there's really good points that you brought up, Michael. But I think we as a people need to remember, if we're going to find a solution, which I believe we can, and when I say a solution, if we can find, that's a workable path forward, a path where we can continue to work, continue to discuss, we can continue to strive to strike this balance. If we're working to strike a balance, that's the goal of our heart, I believe we found a solution. It will always need to be refined. Technology is changing consistently. We're probably going to have laser weapons soon. We're probably going to have all kinds of things soon that will be out there. And there'll be this constant need to reevaluate, rebalance, strike this discussion over and over and over again. But that's something that I think we should look forward to, because it means society is progressing. Humans are progressing. If we're going to reach a path of enlightenment or attainment, we have to go through this cycle. We have to go through these discussions. We have to deal with the technology that exists and figure out how to balance it and make it so that it can be used for good and the bad side minimized as much as possible. So we certainly appreciate you guys being with us today as we talk about the Second Amendment. And we will continue on our Case for America to explore how America came to be, principles that make it what it is, and to really strike into the heart of this notion of confirming our soul and self-control, our liberty and law. And so we will join you next time.